Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this conference presented by Energy Innovation Network on the following topic: assessing the likely future of MaaS by considering the barriers and opportunities around disruption in business across geographies. This panel will be moderated by Junia Compostela, with researcher at UC Davis EIN. Junia, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And please welcome our amazing speakers. We have Aurélien Cotet, Global Sales Director at Instant System. We have Professor Maria Kamarjani, who's the head of the MaaS Lab at University College London. We have Sampo Hietanen, who's the CEO and founder of MaaS Global, and Andrew Salzberg, who is the head of public policy at Transit. So we know that mobility as a service is a disruptive product. And as for any disruptive businesses, there are many barriers attached to it, such as ecosystem, technology implementation, business models, barriers, and the inertia of the users. Mobility as a service in general aim to integrate transportation modes to enable seamless trip planning and ticket purchasing, but it is very clear how this business is affected by an ecosystem barrier, meaning there is a geographical fragmentation and limited institutional integration. And this leads to discontinuities in journeys and increases the cost of use of the systems by consumers and operators. So our first question for the speakers is, can you please tell us a little bit more on the effect of the limited institutional integration on mobility as a service? Maria, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. There are several institutional barriers that hinder the mobility as a service concept to be materialized. However, several cities, they have the willingness to move on to overcome these barriers and support companies to move on with mobility as a service. When the mobility as a service concept started, there were several barriers, but lately we have seen that authorities have started exploring ways of collaborating with other companies, with other mobility service providers. And we launched a survey within Europe during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we see that the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the removal of some of these barriers, because now the public transport system is not that popular, is not preferred by as in the past before the COVID-19. So in some cities where we have just demonstration projects, not commercial MaaS, we see that public authorities, at least for the demos, were willing to overcome some ticketing or data sharing barriers to demonstrate how now the mobility service providers can actually support the public transport system to recover due to the pandemic. But for commercial applications, I think that Sambo and Aurélien are in a better position to speak about this.
Please go ahead.
Oh, all right. So, of course, there's barriers. I mean, like you said, disruptive and not the world's smallest ecosystem. Remembering the numbers, about 20% of household expenditure goes into transportation. We're talking about, you could even call it, if not the biggest, the second biggest machine in the world, the whole transport system itself. So it's not like a gaming thing that we're disrupting. It's quite physical and it's quite tangible. It's quite clear, quite sort of real. Now, on the other hand, let's also face it, what MaaS is up against. Because if we don't liberate the money that is spent on the privately owned vehicle, we're not really disrupting anything. 76% of the market is consumed by the car ownership, which we all know that is used about 4% of the time. So if we're not disrupting that, and that's more of an individual mental issue. And now, where the trouble is, I like the comparison with car industry. We're kind of, first of all, we don't have car factories or any of these. We don't have brands in MaaS yet, which have been built over 100 years. So this is the kind of competition, and you have to love your opponent to be a good sports person. And car is a great product. Now we're in a situation where we have to build our car or our MaaS out of components we do not control, out of components that were never built to actually fit together. So we're building it out of tires that are not actually compatible with the engine and any of these. And we have to muscle them to actually try to get them working as a convenient one package for the end user. Of course, it takes time. I mean, even if everybody was willing in this industry, it would definitely take time to put them in together, because public transport was not planned to go together with micromobility or ride hailing or
Right.
car rental or car share or any of these. We'll have to mash up. That's how it is.
Absolutely. And this is very interesting because I would like to introduce a potential parallel with the airline industry, because the airline industry has found a key to overcome this institutional integration barrier through the starting of the International Air Transport Association, the IATA, which is a neutral, non-for-profit agency that set this transaction and cooperation standards across the airlines. And these standards provided an environment to develop contracts between the multiple operators that brought a lot of benefits, such as facilitated payments through common e-ticketing, or reduced consumers' efforts in completing journeys, planning and transactions. They deliver more optionality to the consumers, such as collecting, for example, miles with one carrier and then spending it with another carrier, or buy other goods and services. So the second question for our speaker is, how do you see replicating the airline model to the mobility as a service? Andrew, do you want to go?
Yeah, please. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are some models already emerging. Yeah, I think what Tempo said is a good piece. You know, we're trying to build a product with wheels that don't belong to us, and how do you actually do that? And I think there are some small examples where that's already working that relate to your airline premise. So obviously, I work in transit, and one of the things we do is consume and display public transport information. And you know, it seems sort of minor now, but you know, real-time information of different public transport systems is provided using the same data standard. So to your earlier institutional question, if I'm in Toronto or San Francisco, where there are dozens of agencies that are operating side by side geographically, because they all share information in the same standard, you know, different iterations of GTFS, it's possible for someone like us to show that to someone as a whole. So you can at least plan your journey across multiple jurisdictions, which now we take for granted, but wasn't true, 10 years ago. And so there has been some examples of that happening. And I think that's something to build on. And generally, I think to relate to your question, I think data standards can help make cooperation possible much more easily, because you don't have to renegotiate sort of partnerships between dozens of agencies and different ride-hail players necessarily. If everybody is willing to publish on the same data standard, then different groups can integrate those in their own spaces. So I think that's a really, really important model. And to your point about IATA as a model and how do airlines work, one of the organizations that we're doing a lot of work with is called Mobility Data. It's also a nonprofit, and they are the ones who maintain things like GTFS for transit and GBFS, which is the equivalent for bike share and scooters, and help make that kind of cooperation simpler, because you don't have to renegotiate again, because data standards can get you over that hump a little bit. So I would say it's far from the end. None of the standards I just talked about involve payment, and I think many of us know the pain of payment integration. But just on the point of discovery, finding, trip planning, there is actually a lot of good progress to point to that we can build off of, and some models of cooperation, how that happens.
Yeah, that's great. Indeed, as Andrew says, there is a big initiation of these airline models for ground transportation, and this standard, so the GTFS, of General Transit Fit Specification. I'm going to make a little introduction for our audience. Was started by Google employees about 15 years ago, and they wanted to find a more friendly way to incorporate transit information into Google Maps. And then, as Andrew said, that the GTFS then expanded into GBFS for bike sharing. Now it's also been expanded on GOFS, general on-demand for on-demand mobility specification. And so the next question would be, so this, we know that this GX generalized FS, it's not alone. For example, in Europe, there is the NETEX standard. And so the next question would be, do you see the fact of having multiple standards a barrier to develop mobility as a service 2.0? Aurélien, do you want to go?
Yeah, so I want to come back also a little bit about the Yotta parallel. The interesting part of Yotta, it was we were talking about aircraft. So it didn't matter, you know, if it was an airline or another one. Most of the time, people that are traveling the same way. You have the airport and the airlines is just a brand. The way you handle the passenger was more or less the same. So to standardize all the airlines that were mainly national at the beginning and regional within the country, it was easier for Yotta. I mean, it took some time, but it was only one way to travel. When we are talking about MaaS, we are talking about so many different mobility services that are not booked, paid, and reserved the same way. So that's why it's also more complicated to try to find the right standards to fit it all. After that, having different standards between Europe and the rest of the world, GTFS versus NETEX, if it's only two standards, we can manage at one moment never to have a parallel between GTFS and NETEX, and it does exist. You have some companies that are that develop some, what I would say, translator between those two, especially because GTFS is used by many different operations, on private operation, on public operations. And even if NETEX was something to be created, not to compete with GTFS, but to have something more European, because we wanted to have something more European, we will find bridges between two. The only problem is to make sure that we, in both sides, we get the right data that are used either for the public transport, for the public authority, and for the private operators, to make sure that they can work together to optimize the flow of mobility within the territories, but also to answer the demand for any kind of MaaS, public, private, B2B, B2C, B2G. And that's where it's very important, is to make sure that we have a good cohesion between the data that are needed for everyone and the data that needs to be shared and the one that could be kept.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. Anybody else wants to contribute to?
Well, I sometimes in this, we in the industry love to overly complicate things. So let's not also make it overly complicated. The technology has much improved since the first parts of data. APIs are pretty much normal. So the first standard of everything is that you just publish your API. You can't get it too much wrong. And look, when I started with this company, we thought that it's a thing to overcome, to have full integrations with payments so that you can actually make a subscriptions out of everything. Now we're live in, well, Finland, Switzerland, Austria, Belgium, Holland, and even Japan. And I forgot UK, for example. Yes. And it has public transport, I mean, city public transport, trains and car shares and car rentals and all kinds of different modes of city bikes and micromobility and even boats and so on and so on. So it's not like an impossible task. It's not an easy one. The more you standardize, but the more you publish is the better. Let's not forget also the background of the Yotta, and what's the most important part of this. Data itself is not much of value if you don't have the contracts to use the means of transportation. The biggest part of the airline thing is that everyone can cross-sell. So they've standardized also the purchasing and selling agreements. If you just flow data, it's not going to be much of a business unless you have actually standardized tickets that you can plug into. So that's what I would urge the whole of Europe, the whole world to get more going so that it makes it easiest. Not to say that standardization wouldn't be awesome.
Right. Yeah, indeed. Like, so sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think on that point, I think Sampo is right that standard is the second importance to just having the ability to do this what you actually want to do. And I think the payment point is clearly much further behind than the information level, right? I think we've all just talked about, okay, maybe there's NetX and GTFS and they're different, but on the payment front, we're nowhere near either one of those things, right? There are people who have APIs for payment. We at Transit can buy tickets in many, many markets across North America, but that's only because we've gotten kind of one-off agreements with transit ticket providers and negotiated their APIs. There's much less openness and certainly no standardization on the payment front. So, you framed the question around NetX versus GTFS. I think Aurélien is right that that's not such a major problem if there's only a couple, but the places where there is no standard and very little sharing, I think, and payment being an obvious example, are the places where I think the real work is. And I think Sampo is right. It's not like a technical feat necessarily now to do that. It's more of a cooperation model. How do you make it happen in many, many places? And how do you do that without necessarily having to have one-to-one negotiations between every partner and every third party everywhere in the world, which, will certainly slow down the competition. And like Sampo's frame, we're trying to build the car with pieces that aren't ours. If we have to renegotiate the relationship between each wheel and each, the tail light, it's going to be a slow process.
Yeah, indeed, like as Andrew said, like the payment. So the technology is there, like for data exchange, but the technology is still a big issue. So indeed, there is now a platform through which the traveler can purchase a complete trip from A to B. We still need to get permission from the transit authority to sell their tickets through a multi-platform, or mobility service providers. They don't want to be integrated with third parties, so they don't open up. So the question for our speaker is, how do we find a common ground to make sure that there is an obligation for public transit and mobility service providers to open up? Anybody wants to answer this?
I can gladly start. First of all, I understand the worry for public transit agencies and all of them, because there is a risk that they're somehow pushed, because they're public. Once they open up, they have to then pretty much open up to everyone else. That's how it goes. Now, having said that, when they open up, the others don't play with the same rules necessarily. So let's just play with the idea that, and I can get this in some of the cities where you say, okay, we have to open up. So here's Uber, who's dominating then the ride hailing part. So they'll just plug in for the benefit of a side thing. As a sidekick, they plug in public transit. But at the same time, no MaaS operator can ever plug into their system, which kind of makes them be on top of this. So it is it's a bit of an issue, or it's a big issue for everyone, because at the same time, we're trying to split the cake when we don't even have eggs at the moment. But I do understand the worry, how to make sure that then everybody plays with the same rules. Now, gladly, there's a tiny little, the Asterix comics, where there's a tiny little village somewhere in, but that's in Belgium this time. It's in Antwerp, where I think that they've made the right policy. I really urge everyone to go and have a look. Talk to Quinn Kennis, they're pretty open about it, where they've just mandated that everyone out there, you need to, because they don't want this playing around, because you can also do it. Yes, we are technically open, but the contract we're offering is just impossible. So yeah, nobody takes it. And then you're just, oh, sorry. So they've mandated that anyone who works in there, they welcome every mobility provider, and they just mandate you have to have 3 MaaS operators that you have plugged in. So you have made the contract that it's done, which is, it's an amazing, it's these tiny little policy issues that I think will crack the whole thing. And I'd be glad to say that this market is run by us, the companies, but that's not true. The biggest innovations actually happen in the policy, because it's such a big field.
Right.
Yeah. I have to agree with Sampo. It's the main real issue right now in the MaaS industry is trust. And the only way to to create an environment where the trust can be there between the actors, the private and the public, to make sure that we try to find the right recipe with the eggs, and then create the right cake that could have all the flavors for everyone. And that's the real problem here. It's first, technically speaking, we will find a solution. But first, we need to make sure that everyone understands what we can do and not be afraid of sharing, to be able to create something bigger than each of us. And that's where it's very important that to find a right regulation to enable the innovation. If innovation comes from the public transport, great. If it comes from outside, great too. At the end of the day, what's the most important is to think about the end user. And the end user is the one who's going to decide. So if you have enough solution within one city like Antwerp, people will use the one that is the most convenient for them. If it's the one from the public transport, it's going to be the one from public transport who's going to be the most used. If it's the one that is coming from a B2C, it's going to be the one from B2C. But at the end of the day, the end user will choose.
I just that it has to be fair competition rules.
Exactly.
And nobody uses their bully power.
I was going to, on that point, on the fairness, and I think Sampo singling out Uber as a place where, public standards and public data feeds from public transportation have been, well ahead of the curve. You mentioned, 2005 for GTFS and adoption since then, so it's well ahead. One of the interesting things, and I know this firsthand because I used to work at Uber, but there's no GTFS equivalent, even just for the discovery of a taxi or ride-hail service. And we talked earlier about how standards might not be the first step, but I actually think in this case they would really help. So it's actually hard for any city to say there should be a fair competition like Sampo is talking about, because we don't have the language to say you as a ride-hail or taxi operator should provide this feed. So one of the things we're working on right now with mobility data, and if people are interested, please reach out, we can connect you, is to build that data standard, which again, like many people have said, it's not technically complicated. What's the ETA for a taxi or a ride-hail? What's the price going to be from A to B? But no one's ever put that down on paper, what that should look like. And I think if we had that, there'd be much more and much easier opportunity to ask for the same kinds of feeds from different operators. Again, that still doesn't get into the payment processing, which is the more complicated part. But I think if we're missing even the data standard for taxi, ride-hail, et cetera, we're kind of starting with data standards for scooters and bikes, data standards for transit, but a big missing piece on ride-hail and taxis. I think that can also help to kind of shore up part of the ecosystem that hasn't happened and maybe open up a little more, two-way cooperation on some of the data stuff we're talking about.
And there's micromobility. There's a lot of other stuff.
Yeah,
right,
microtransit.
Right.
I mean, yeah, other places.
Yeah. The other thing is there might be the chance that public transit and mobility service provider open to some providers and not to others. And so I was interested to learn a little bit more about your opinion on potential killing innovation, especially if these providers, the one who end up to be this public transit and mobility service provider open up, are the usual big player, and this might lead to also a biased vision of how we move around. So how do we preserve fair competition and continue to fuel innovation in the MaaS arena?
So I'm gonna start on this one because you were talking about Asterix, so it's the French character in Brittany. So I'm gonna talk about France and the Loi of Mobility. So it's something that has been put in place in France to try to open up everything to make sure that we have a fair competition, and especially to make sure that the big player in the private domain won't, I would say, prevent the small one to also try something and try to be a big one too. So in the Loi de la Mobilité is as soon as you want to play in the arena of MaaS, if you open up for everyone. And that's, I know that at the beginning, the public transport were kind of reluctant to this kind of law. And now what we are seeing is we are seeing all those big players of transport on demand, ride-hailing companies that are like, yeah, but we are not against opening our things, our services, but we don't want to be integrated everywhere. We want to choose where we want to be integrated. And that's where it's very interesting is how you make sure that if you want to create a MaaS, like imagine Sampo wants to go in a city, if everything is open because the API are there, how Sampo should be able to say, okay, I want to integrate this service, or not necessarily having to take only the small ones. So that's how the law of mobility, when it's going to be really enforced, going to help to make sure that to make sure that the innovations can still come from the smallest players.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where, well, believe it or not, it was a USVC when a long time ago, almost 10 years ago, I was introducing the whole MaaS concept, and he said that this is, and disruptions in any kind of field there that one company can do, they're done. And now this is only the big ones are left, and it kind of needs political leadership in creating the rules. I kind of like now that it's soon to be the soccer Europeans where Finland is playing for the first time. I like that analogy because it's a bit like, at the moment, Finns go out there, we actually want to play ice hockey. The Japanese would want to do sumo wrestle. I know Canadians would want to do ice hockey as well, but probably the French would want to play soccer. And it's not fun for anyone. It's not, spectators are the users out there. They don't like that. Well, for some while, but it's not going to be a good league. Players don't end up liking it, so companies or no one else, and it's not good for anyone. So someone needs to set the goal rules and be a referee. But then remember also, referees are not the best players in the world, just like players are not the best referees. So it's to make the ground rules, make things happen. For the standardization, now we're getting into payments, and like with Yotta, they are absolutely worth, and I'm being a bit dramatic, they're worth nothing if there's not standardized agreements. I mean, we've seen these places where you have technical standards, you could get into a city, but you can't strike the deals. So what do you do with it? You could actually use it, but actually you can't because you don't have a contract to actually resell and do whatever you do with the MaaS. So we need to make sure that those are standardized as well. In the light of what is a low entry barrier, I understand that many of the cities, they're lacking also tools. The authorities, they want to do MaaS, but all they're given by the system of how we build urban communities and how the authorities in cities and governments are, they have this one way of doing things. It's let's plan something, make a tender out, pick the winner. Sorry to say, guys, this doesn't go that way. You can't pick the winner. So we'll have to find also for getting this started, if we want to kind of speed up the evolution, and there seems to be quite a lot of willingness to push a bit of money also into pushing MaaS, don't choose us or anyone else. Make sure that the users do the tenders. So we have a lot of players simultaneously. That's the only way to lower entry barriers. Yeah.
I have a question. Now with the COVID-19 pandemic, have you noticed any change in the behavior of the cities? Now the public transport systems are at risk. The demand is too low, and they are trying to find ways to at least increase a little bit the demand, the passengers. And in our research, many cities have mentioned that they try to do MaaS as before. But is there any change in their behavior now during the COVID-19?
We at least see a big change. Public transport out, micromobility, bikes in, cars in, car shares, other modes, but public transport's been suffering, and at least so to us.
And I think, yeah,
but
go
the
on.
public transport authorities side, have you seen any change in terms of wanting to open up?
I think there are different things. When before I just joined the Instant System, but previously I was working for Transdev, and what I saw is also we speed up a lot of our digitalization in a lot of operations. What I mean by this is it's true that the public transport wasn't really digitalized in many medium cities, for instance. So it was very difficult to get the right kind of information that are needed in the MaaS, and especially the ticketing. The ticketing was not digitalized. And when it was digitalized, it was only digitalized for a single ticket. Because the people who were using the transport, public transport daily, they needed also to have their yearly pass or monthly pass digitalized. And suddenly you started to have a digitalization of the system that could enable the MaaS in a better way, not the single, not the people who are using the public transport once in a while and are buying a ticket through an app. There you could have a real users that are using the public transport monthly, yearly, every day to commute, and to open up with a MaaS to have a first mile, last mile. So on this part, yes, I saw an openness. And then I think the public transport start to really understand how to optimize their own network. And they can't do that without the other actors in the playground.
I would echo some of that from the North American side. Sorry, Maria, to answer your question. I think I've seen more on the, in the early part of the pandemic, people thought that physical contact with stuff was risky. I think we think that less now, but it prompted a lot of mobile ticketing things that were not happening at the speed they might have in North America. So many smaller agencies, like EIN was talking about, now have mobile ticketing enabled and APIs there that someone like Transit can help you pay for a ticket. That didn't happen. And those procurements sometimes happen in a matter of weeks that would previously take a long time. That's one trend. And the other is there's been a growing number of kind of on-demand or micro-transit pilots, which when they're launched, I think prompt questions about how you integrate that on-demand service with the core of your main public transport service. And that I think starts to get to some of the questions we're talking about. How do you find it in one place and pay for it in one place? So there has been some moves, even in the midst of public transport having, pretty devastating declines in ridership, to a little bit more either just digitization at a basic level or integrating new modes of service.
That's great. So we have some questions from the audience. There is one traveler-oriented. So they ask, what is the user attitude and perception of a fully integrated mobility as a service where trips can be planned and purchased with just one ticket or membership? Maybe Maria, you want to answer this?
Yeah. So we see that when we start our surveys with where we do MaaS demonstrations, we always ask people how the potential users, how they perceive this service. And we always get positive responses about such a service. But when they actually use such a service, their attitudes and perceptions are even more positive. We see that they like the fact that everything is integrated in an application. They don't have to open different apps to have cash or to buy tickets, and our demonstrations are of limited time, but we see that when we stop the demo, they would like to continue using such services because they make their life much easier. And this is to the part of, let's say, the short-term travel behavior. But when we go to the mid-term travel behavior, the topic that Sambo likes a lot, the car ownership, we see that users from younger generations, they say that if there are such services, there is not even a need to buy my personal car, or I will considerably delay purchasing my own car. So whatever we discuss about data openness, contracts are in place, and we have such systems, we see that the users are really happy with this.
So it does also show from our studies. So users are way ahead of the industry. Sorry to say, out of the users in Helsinki, where we've been longest, and even during the COVID, there was a sample of some users. 12% of them said that they had avoided buying a car. 12% of them said that they have sold their car because of the service, which to me at least is more than I would have expected, because we're not really there yet with all of these. Out of this monthly subscribers, where the subscription is based heavily on public transportation, but it has all the other components inside. Roughly about, if I remember, roughly 60% of them said that they use WIM app as the only solution for them. It's more than I would have expected myself, to be quite honest. So quite actually promising results. It's still early days, but the trend, like Maria said, and it seems to be everywhere, that people are much more ready than we in industry are.
So a question, a clarification. Are we talking about which geographical area, like a more European territory, or like
just done in Helsinki, because it's by far the most mature one, where we have enough users that been there for a period of time, and where the offer is even close to a good enough subscription. So
right.
Northern,
Go ahead.
Northern Europe, but the sort of willingness, we've done quite a lot of market studies. The willingness in European cities, they all seem to be quite, between 30 to 40% of population would be kind of willing to be at a level where this is as good as a car, so they would be willing to give up their cars for a service like this. It's still it's not, until you see them paying, you don't know for sure, but in Helsinki we could really see the effects.
And from my side, the surveys are from the UK, Luxembourg, and Budapest.
Okay.
So
we are.
Me, yeah, I just wanted to add one thing also. It's what is very important is like there are a difference between the people who are living in the center of a city, where you have all those micromobility on the public transport, versus the people who are living in the suburb and distant suburbs, and that's those people who are mainly using the car to go to travel from the suburbs to the center. And that's where the MaaS could also play a big role in if we include, unfortunately, the private car at the beginning of a journey. So in being able to show the park on ride. So I take my car, I go to park to a mobility hub and take the public transport to go to the center. And it's true that when you think about Google Maps or Waze, where, I mean, when you have a car that's the one that you are using, you miss the opportunity to see that you have alternative. Maybe you could use your private car at the beginning, but you could use also alternative on shared and common mobilities.
Can I add really fast, because there's one addition to the suburbs where we think that MaaS wouldn't apply. We've seen actually quite a lot of people in the suburbs, and especially when you can plug in, and this is why payment is Google itself will not be good enough. Sorry to say that.
I do agree.
What we get as stories is those that are roughly about outside of boundaries, about 2 and up to 5 kilometers from the train station. When you have a fixed rate taxi that brings you to the train station, they're willing to give up their cars, and that we've seen quite a lot of those that actually do. But it needs to be packaged extremely conveniently.
Right. So we are 2 minutes away from the end. I just wanted to say that. So bye everybody before. Go ahead, please.
So in one of the cities that we had in our research, the app did not offer electronic tickets for all the transport modes. For the public transport system, they had to go to the ticketing machine to buy their ticket. But even in this case, that the information was integrated and all the other transport modes were integrated, this was also positively perceived by users. So there is no need to have a perfect MaaS now. We can start step by step.
Okay, so we are 1 minute away. So if you guys have anything to add to this question topic, we have a little bit more time.
I do want to do quick echo what Aurélien said earlier about the kind of regulation that is involved in the mobility law in France. I think there, at least in North America, we have this distinction between, well, public systems should be run by public agencies and maybe private involvement is bad. I think it's a little bit too simple. And I think to the earlier points, what we need is the public interest being expressed in the market. And I think Sampo's point about competition is a good one. You want the user ultimately to decide. There's too many failed efforts to commission a MaaS app that fails because no one uses it. So I think we really want to focus the regulation on how do we open up the market, but allow people to choose something that works for them. And I think too often we kind of skip over that because we sort of want to jump to, well, I want to build MaaS rather than how do we set up the tools and the plumbing to actually make it work. So I want to jump in and use that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody, for this amazing opportunity to be the moderator of this panel. I think we are about to close this 9:50, and I just wanted to thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.